Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1557, and it is titled, What is a Liberal? Written by E. Hadelman Julius, who is the editor and publisher of the Little Blue Book collection. So, this is What is a Liberal according to the 1920s definition. And we pick up on it looks like page 16. So here we go, part 2 of What is a Liberal according to the 1920s. Liberalism is, I believe, an impossible attitude for a man who is entirely without generous impulses and a sense of justice and a disposition to play fairly and honorably. Aside from any question of specific theory, a true liberal is quick on impulse to jump to the defense of any individual or group that is being harshly, unjustly treated. He, the true liberal, has a keen, spirited appreciation of human values, which is not beholden to any precise code and which rises above any limitations of logic or theory. The easy-going way, the way that is, which makes things most kindly easy for one's fellows, is the liberal way. The liberal would not wish to sacrifice his fellow man to a cold and dutiful theory. He would not forget, in gazing upon the grand and awesome assemblage and procession of power, the natural interest of even the humblest creature. He could not possibly believe that a narrow code or a narrow crushing show of force could rightfully transcend the simplest considerations of humanity. He is a liberal because, first and last, he is a humane, not merely technically a human being. He is humane, not merely technically a human being. He loves freedom, not altogether or in a narrow sense selfishly, but because loving his fellow man and having only peaceful intentions toward all freedom is the kind and agreeable and expansive atmosphere which he finds most pleasant. Am I my brother's keeper? Is a question that not all liberals would answer alike. Some are more interested than others in the welfare of their fellow men. Some, especially those who have a heavy load of morality to carry with them everywhere, may appear to be officiously interested in keeping their brethren in a straight and narrow path, although this tendency, I repeat, is illiberal and is really in contradiction with such liberal views as a man may profess. Some liberals are very active in movements of social reform. Others are rather more skeptical, and while feeling goodwill towards such movements, do not participate actively in their efforts. But any man who is at heart and in general attitude a liberal, even though he is not inspired by a hopeful and industrious zeal for improving the lot of his fellows, is friendly toward all movements and suggestions that look to the broadening and brightening of life. If he has an attitude of skepticism toward, say, a utopian program, still, that skepticism is not based by any narrow or self-interested desire to maintain an unjust or imperfect condition. He has no ulterior designs that would lead him to scoff insincerely at or to obstruct such schemes for social betterment. In other words, albeit the phrase has been much overworked, has, in fact, been used loosely and disingenuously and copied with gospels that are unintelligent. Goodwill may be emphasized as an ever-present characteristic of all who are liberal-minded. We may agree that goodwill is a pretty uncertain quality on which to depend when it is not backed and guided by intelligence. It may be in some respects a sentimental waste when there is pages to turn. When there is there we go. When there is no wisdom with it. Yet fundamentally, it is a right and important attitude, and it furnishes a certain emotional force that is invaluable to liberalism. It means, really, that liberals are disposed not simply as a matter of calm, reasoned conviction, but as a matter of genuine feeling to take the humane side of any question. I wish my fellows well, therefore. I believe in freedom for them. Therefore, I would prefer them to be prosperous and happy. Therefore, I favor a wide latitude in which they can pursue their various aims of labor and enjoyment. Therefore, I wish them to be helped, not hampered, in self-realization and self-expression. It is social mindedness, and this social mindedness, quite obviously, has been a great agency of progress, allowing for all other motives and admitting that many steps beneficial to humanity have been taken without that object clearly in view. It remains to be said that without a liberal interest or a humane interest or a progressive interest, all three being more or less synonymous, in the general welfare, the major triumphs of progress would have been unthinkable. All great humanitarians and advocates of new thought and laborers for social improvement have been liberals. Some of them more than that, radicals and revolutionaries. Yet, whatever name one gives them, it is clear that they were inspired by a zeal, not merely selfish, but including their fellows, for liberty and knowledge and happiness. The battles of free thought were certainly waged by men who had a wide liberal interest in what Haney called releasing the imprisoned energies of the human spirit. I'll pause there. Hydration. And then the cause for the need for hydration. Medication. Alrighty, here we go. No man who was indifferent to ideas as they affected his fellow man, who was indifferent to the social consequences of bigotry, who had no care for the benefits of enlightenment, as they might be generally shared, would have set himself to combat the narrow-mindedness and the harsh intolerance of medievalism. It was the understanding that ideas are not exclusively the concern of and are not confined in their consequences to any one individual or group or official institution, which gave force to the activities of the champions of free thought. True, these men individually were impatient of restrictions. They could not help demanding the fullest right to exercise their own minds and pens and tongues. They were stimulated, too, by the thrill of fighting in a good cause, but that they were first and last animated and vastly strengthened by a social-minded outlook, no fair observer can deny. Similarly, the opposition to monarchy, to all forms of despotism and unjust rule and government, was socially inspired. This does not mean that a socialistic ideal was envisioned by these pioneers of modernism. They were, of course, individualist, for the suggestions and the urgent demands of our complex modern society, which invalidate a good deal that was basic in the old individualism, were unknown to them. But if those fighters for progress wage their war in the name of individualism, they are at any rate believed in a wide and they at any rate believed in a wide and free individualism. Itchy eyebrow. They were interested broadly in the welfare, in the liberation, in the enlightenment of their fellow men. In fact, the moment we touch upon any general condition, the moment we go beyond the immediate things that concern ourselves as private persons, we are thrown upon necessarily social considerations. The idea of political liberty, for example, included all who were the victims of tyranny. It could not have been a narrowly advocated idea. Social mindedness, as it was understood a couple of centuries ago, was revealed in that early agitation. Take more generally the interest in culture, in the development of knowledge, in the ideal that finally came to life of proper education. Here we see the labors of men who may have worked very individually, in solitude, and sometimes with an apparent indifference to the mass of humanity. Certainly the scholar is apt to be rather remote from the main stream of popular agitation. But nevertheless, we see that this growth of culture has been cumulatively and wideningly social in its nature. So who is seemingly the most selfish, solitary, unsocial person, laboring in any field or culture, contributes to the valuable heritage of mankind? The upshot of his labors is, too, that life is liberalized for his fellow men. Ignorance has visited great suffering upon men in the past, and insofar as wise and patient men have labored to increase the knowledge of their fellows and to present a more fairly intelligible viewpoint of life, the possibilities of happiness have increased for all. The record of his political and private life shows that Francis Bacon was a very selfish, scheming fellow. It seems that he could and did take rather mean advantages, and that his chief interest, in practical day-by-day business, was the enrichment and advancement of Francis Bacon. This was one side of the man, but who can deny that he had a fine, and, as the future was to show, an enormously useful measure of social mindedness? It was largely due to the influence of Bacon that the idle, hair-splitting speculations of the medieval schoolmen were shown up as the nonsense they were. That the notion of knowledge, or mental activity that had really nothing to do with knowledge, as an esoteric, dignified, remote game of playing with essentially puerile, though pretentiously flabbergasting ideas, was discredited and came to be regarded as unworthy of the powers of really intelligent men. That the pursuit and the application of knowledge was given a useful direction, and men began to study the facts of life, that they might learn how they and their fellows could better live. Of course, Bacon was not a social-minded person in the political, economic, or extensively cooperative modern sense. Perhaps he was not an altruist, though he gave pretty strong intimations of that attitude, probably as compensation to himself for his selfish political career. Yet he must rank high among the beneficiaries of humanity. Orthodox scholars of his day regard Bacon as an irreverent and dangerous radical. In a sense, he was radical, but for our present purpose, we can say turning the page. Pages are so thin. We can say, dun, 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 that he was a liberal. That is to say, he advocated the liberalization, the humanization of knowledge. It is, I believe, the aim of the liberal to widen the scope of human activity, interest, and enjoyment. He is impatient of narrow boundaries and restrictive codes. Beyond the fundamental necessities of social order, the liberal condemns any tendency to bind and impose dictation upon men. Social mindedness, to the true liberal, is a concern for the cooperative agreements that will give the greatest freedom to all men. We cannot, as I have said, live entirely to ourselves, but we can agree to dwell together in a reasonable social latitude and amity, with rules that are sensible and yielding enough to include all fair possibilities of human need. I'll pause for a second, take a drink. Here, indeed, we see the difference between the liberal and the bigot, or dogmatist, or traditionalist. The former wants rules, so to speak, that incline favorably toward freedom, that do not hamper the happy efforts of human nature, and do not bind all men, regardless of reason or temperament, or various possible contingencies, to a narrow and unalterable code, whereas the latter, whether or not they conclusively have such an aim, stand forth as advocates of an ungenerous repression and a limited scheme of life. There are many who stress rules, laws, duties, traditions, and the like, as if these were innately sacred. They tend to forget what purpose, if any, these rules and traditions were intended to serve. They regard rules as being the end rather than the means. On the other hand, and most sensibly in contrast, the liberal never forgets that rules are simply means of making life go more smoothly and agreeably. That this, at any rate, is the sole reasonable justification of rules. It is, then, says the liberal, important that such rules shall be broad and generous enough to include all phases, all tolerable phases, of human nature, that such rules shall be capable of fairly varied application according to circumstances, that such rules shall be as broad, as enlightened, as humanly considerate as possible. And the object of any rules or laws or traditions, as the liberal sees them, should be to facilitate a happier life for men generally. No matter how eloquently a conversation or code of morals may be defended, if its effect is to limit or embarrass the quest for happiness, that code stands condemned from the liberal viewpoint. There is no moral defense fine enough to justify it. It does mischief, even positive injury, rather than good. I think that this attitude very significantly helps to define the liberal, i.e., as one who wants men to be free and happy, and who objects to harshly, dogmatically narrow rules which interfere with this freedom and happiness. It is illustrated well with regard to the question of marriage and divorce, which I have previously mentioned. It is impossible for the genuine liberal to look upon marriage as a strictly, unalterably binding agreement between a man and a woman. He sees clearly that such a rule would defeat the end of happiness and of justice no less. It is a dogma and not a sensible rule adapted to the needs of life. Pause there, take a drink. And a little toke. And on to reading. In a word, rules should not be carried to the extreme of slavery. They should not be exaggerated as inherently true and without exception binding. But they should be regarded simply as means, flexible and varying, toward the end of happiness for the greatest number of men and women. I noticed that's the first time it mentioned the happiness of women also. Previously, it was just all men. 1920s mindset. Although liberalism can and should be stated in intellectual terms, it is not necessarily an intellectual attitude. As a matter of fact, some persons who are very intellectual have a stiff, repressive, illiberal sort of mind, while, on the other hand, among uneducated and unthinking people, liberalism is frequently observed as a natural attitude. One may talk with quite ordinary people, who have no clear understanding of social interest, who do not reason out any convictions, who are unaware of the larger intellectual movements of the world, yet who, as a matter of basic naturalness, have a liberal attitude towards things. Here, for instance, is a working man who has not done much thinking and who is, in fact, a rough, uncultured fellow. He has not paid attention to opposing schools of thought, nor has he reflected at all profoundly upon the problems of life. It would be perhaps stretching a point to say that he has convictions, but he has impulses that are liberal. He has a natural reaction to life that is tolerant and agreeable, and thus he illustrates a viewpoint that is not always certainly to be found, as it should be, among educated people. This contrast, I confess, has been thrust upon me unavoidably and sometimes unexpectedly. That is to say, I once made the mistake of confusing an outward show of culture with an inward sense of free thought and liberalism, but now I know better. For I have read essays written by the most suave and ingeniously cultured men who were, as shown by their ideas, a bottom dogmatist of the most complete and fierce description. Most sedately, an educated man may write in favor of some form of slavery, while his more humble, uneducated fellow may express ideas of liberty. I find indeed that among working men the most easy, liberal ideas prevail. That my pressman, for example, has no wish to thrust his own conception of life upon others, but that he is specially intent upon living his own life, and as an essential part of that scheme, letting others live their own lives. If I speak to my pressman on the question of marriage, for example, he will reply to this effect: if a man and a woman do not make a go of it, why shouldn't they be separate? If a man or a woman cannot be happy in married life, in a permanent compact with one another, why shouldn't he or she seek happiness in some other way? Ordinary men frequently have, it seems, a kind of instinctive understanding that amid the varied urges of human nature and the different constitutions of individuals, life cannot be tied down with a tight set of rules, that a good deal of leeway is necessary, and that, moreover, the world is not going headlong to the devil because someone chooses to act a bit unconventionally. As I say, this ordinary attitude is sometimes better than a carefully considered cultured attitude by which, with great show of wise saws and ancient instances, an illiberal philosophy is defended. I recall a patriotic triad by the late Brander Matthews. And I haven't looked up any of these people. I wonder who Brander Matthews is. Somebody look it up. Tell me down in the comments. A very cultured but conservative man, which was an unreasonable and unjust as bad-spirited as one could imagine. Even educated men were led by the late war propaganda to rave about the Germans as if they were quite outside the pale of proper normal humanity. On moral questions, educated Puritans often put to shame the belief that man is a reasoning creature, expressing what is, after all, nothing but their own extremely prejudiced taste. They set up what they claim is a standard which all men should respect on pain of damnation, swift and sure. Professor Brown may produce a long argument pretending to show how antisocial and immoral divorce is. Yet Bill Smith thinking not at all and certainly not capable of building up much of an argument, may be far nearer the truth in his instinctively free attitude toward the subject. Liberalism, to be sure, is an intelligent and well-reasoned philosophy of life, and its propaganda is beneficial in clearing the air and setting many people on the right track. Good reason can show how wrong and unnecessary is a restrictive policy, and the facts very impressively show the messy irrelevance and futility of such a policy. And the fact, after all, liberalism is the philosophy of live and let live, which it would seem could scarcely fail of appealing to any thoughtful person who really wants to take the reasonable view and who is not, turning the page, who is not ruptured, that doesn't make sense, who is not corrupted by a burden of prejudice and ill will. Even so, there is a kind of temperament that is naturally disposed toward liberalism, and that is why we find even among the uneducated many who, in so far as their averageness goes, in so far as they are called upon to express an opinion or to consider the various problems that urgently press for discussion, by the mere impulse of their nature, judge fairly. Chief among the ranks of those who oppose liberalism are, of course, the individuals and groups that have professional or economic reasons for maintaining an illiberal regime. There are the preachers, for example. We do not expect them to display a very liberal attitude, although the effect of modern progress and criticism has been to modify the pretensions of religion, so that a good many of the clerical brethren find it safer and more profitable to speak rather gently on some questions. Outside of the most unregenerate, unenlightened fundamentalist circles, the really hopeless and inhumane religion of 50 years ago is not given very friendly consideration. That religion depended upon ignorance, and as men have learned more wisely to reflect and more freely to behave in a world of increased light and realistic interest, the old dogmas have lost their powerful influence. Still, we seldom look for, and as seldom find, very much liberalism in a man who is professionally engaged in telling others what they must do to be saved and what is the path of virtue they must follow or be condemned as sinners. They have to earn their living. They have to keep together their flocks by some pretense of special wisdom or righteousness. They have to set forth a certain gospel, and that gospel is most likely to have an illiberal aim. Where there is one John Haynes Holmes, who is on social and moral questions, is a liberal, there are 1,000 preachers who, even when they are in some sort modern in their attitude toward religion, take a narrowly moral attitude on questions that concern the adjustment of personal relations and the search, which according to the liberal must be naturally free and varied, for a realistic, full, many-sided happiness. There is no denying that religion has been a major illiberal force in the life of mankind. It has done harm not merely in imposing false notions upon men, but those notions have, in the things of practical life, narrowed men's range of thought and action. They have had an insidiously, or often a brazenly crippling and corrupting and poisoning influence, making more difficult a realization of the wholesome possibilities of life. When it had the power, of course, the Church maintained a terrible tyranny, which, we can now clearly see, resulted in a vast amount of needless, wretched suffering. The Church was sponsor for the most pernicious kind of illiberalism, namely an obscurantism that prevented the recognition of knowledge as an important advancing factor in the affairs of mankind. And again, religion has oppressed, and still does, men with unreasonably stiff and narrow opinions concerning behavior, so that they have been persuaded to deny themselves many fine and beautiful things under the dark illusion that such things were sinful. There has never been a more oppressive and foolish idea than the idea that somewhere outside our universe is a God who has laid down certain stern, forbidding commandments for the behavior of men. Obviously, such an idea opens the way for charlatans and bigots. Obviously, such an idea corrupts man's nature and lays him unmercifully open to all manner of morbid, strange fancies and fears. Welcome to the day, kids. Sounds very familiar. There we see another element of illiberalism, namely the ugly element of fear, creating illusionary shapes to affright and hamper men. It would be impossible to estimate the amount of terrible, ghastly harm that has been done by the fear of a future life with its alleged uncertain or narrowly defined gamble of rewards and punishments. A great deal of nonsense is written about the hope of immortality, yet it has more significantly bulked as a cause of fear, and men have been terrified into cheating themselves in real life because of what might happen to them after death. And religion, again, is in its nature a foe to reason. Certain dogmas are insisted upon, which are identified narrowly and finely and absolutely with truth, and which are said to be beyond the result of reach of criticism. That they are not beyond the reach of criticism is proved, of course, by the very impressive and successful activity of critics. But, even so, the mischief is done so far as a great many susceptible people are concerned. They let themselves be deluded and dogmatically bound by the claims of religion, which, even after being furbished and stretched by the lingo of modernism, is incompatible with a happy, freely realistic attitude towards life. One must further bear in mind that aside from their definite commitment to a narrow, illiberal religion, preachers are numbered among those conservatives who, in a general way, have an interest in upholding things as they are, who depend a great deal upon traditions and find in the philosophy of a fixed, unchanged social order a means of reliable support and assurance that they will continue to enjoy power and prestige, who, in short, fear in liberalism a threat to the familiar, established scheme of life with which their prejudices, their tastes, their training, and their interest are involved. It is, of course, easy to see how the economic interest of many leading citizens strongly incline them toward conservatism and imbue them with an antagonism toward the liberal view on social questions. Naturally, such men resent any discussion that would challenge and unsettle the conditions under which they profitably engage in exploitive activities. They are alarmed when there is too much critical and zealous discussion of public affairs, of social measures, of liberalizing movements which would interfere with their operations and which emphasize the rights of the masses as against the claims of oppressive private interest. The motive of economic determinism works plainly enough, and its forcefulness cannot be denied. It is, undoubtedly, illiberal in its tendency. It is, of course, broader than the mere question of a certain economic loss. More largely, such men realize that, even when their particular schemes of profit are not assailed, proposals of change and a procedure of a progressive criticism are alarming in their suggestiveness. Even when it is a moral issue that is brought to the fore, even when a general policy of freedom and toleration and enlightenment is advocated, our leading citizens perceive a menace to their ramified interest of conservatism. It has always been true that those who have an extraordinarily large stake in the social order are hostile to the unsettling inquiries and demands of liberalism. Things as they are seem very suitable to them. Conservatism on all questions seems to them the most favorable safe attitude, and they naturally fear the influence of free thought no matter what direction it takes. So true. There are, finally, the persons who by temperament are hostile to the attitude of liberalism. They are ruled absolutely by their prejudices, and they cannot bear the thought that others shall be free to pursue a different way of life. There are many persons who are just naturally born to be meddlers, so it seems, with the lives of their fellows, and who are illiberally bent upon deciding for others questions that are, after all, quite personal. Illiberalism is, at bottom, the disposition of narrowness and ill will that impels a man to interfere unfairly, officiously, mischievously with the lives of his fellow men. And there you go. That is the end of Little Blue Book number 157. What is a liberal? Written by E. Hadelman Julius. Copyright 1920s. So there you go. 1920s definition of a liberal. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.